the kind of people that they were. What were their names?
Moses.
And his sister Miriam. Okay, very good. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on. And so here we have Miriam and Aaron, born in Egypt, working hard to put down the roots of their spiritual lives. Not only themselves, but of the generations that came before them, and try to keep those spiritual roots with, what did Matt say? Golden apples swinging over your head, okay? Fruit, bearing fruit for their spiritual lives. All right, who's our next character in the story? Moses, okay? And she became pregnant and gave birth to a what? Oh, no big deal. Gave birth to a son. No big deal. And when she saw that he was what? A fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Why did she have to hide him? Okay, so we're going to talk about that. How did we get here? We got here because one of the other characters in our story has a title. And what is his title? Pharaoh. Many years later, a new king came to power. This is back to Exodus chapter 1. He did not what? He did not know what Joseph had done for Egypt. What had Joseph done for Egypt?
Saved him.
Saved him. We say that, just like so easily, don't we? Because that's, for us, how we keep the roots of our spiritual history alive. We know the story that Joseph was brought to Egypt as a slave. Say it again. Slave. Say it one more time. Slave. Isn't that interesting? Turn me down. Thank you. He was brought to Egypt as a slave, but you know the story. He formed a relationship with the Pharaoh of the time. And that Pharaoh recognized in him a spiritual insight that saved his nation. So I want you to just think about it, because we want the stories to be close. We want them to come close. We want them to be a part of our everyday life. This is a geopolitical situation, correct? A geopolitical situation. Is God involved in that geopolitical situation? Is God involved in redeeming in the middle of a very difficult geopolitical situation? Oh yes, thank you. So I think we should have already come to the place, friends, where as Americans, because unfortunately as Americans we do this, we and those who of our founding fathers who signed that declaration of what? Independence. Not a bad idea. A God-given idea, I believe, but sometimes it gets us in trouble. So the days of us not being able to talk about the geopolitical situation should be over. We don't want to lose our way because we don't know how to talk to one another about the hard realities of the world that we live in. So the question always comes up when we talk about these Bible texts, who was this Pharaoh who knew not Joseph? Now, if you've seen the Cecil B. DeMille version of the story, then eventually you're going to get to Ramses II. So he wouldn't have been here in the story, he would have been later in the story, but we're not going to suggest that. Your quarterly doesn't suggest it, I don't suggest it, because Ramses had too many kids. You need to have a situation, when the scholars argue about the Egyptian dynasties, where there was somewhere for the story to be plausible, and this is the suggestion that I think is a very plausible suggestion, the 18th dynasty. Ahmose I defeated the Hyksos, and we believe him as a very good candidate for the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, who got this whole story started. But I want you to remember what kind of a situation was set up geopolitically and socially for Joseph and his family. And then all of a sudden, there was a terrible time of change. Did it happen slowly? I don't know. When you read the story, it doesn't feel like it happened so slowly. It feels like it happened rather quickly. And I think we're starting to feel that, are we not? Ourselves. The change on the wind. Let music swell the breeze and ring from all the the trees, sweet freedom's ring. Let mortal tongues awake, let all that breathe partake, let rocks their silence break, the sound prolong. Our fathers, God, to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God our King. The freedom they knew, it disappeared. And it disappeared quickly because of the geopolitical situation. Look, he said to his people, this is the Pharaoh talking, the Israelites have become what? Too numerous and too powerful for us. So he's operating from a perspective of what? What's his perspective?
Fear.
He's afraid. Anything else you want to throw in the soup? He's being very nationalist in his perspective, that famous thing we do, us and them. Anything else you want to add to the soup? It's okay. I want you to understand that the land that they worked, if you look at the little black letters next to the big red letters at the top of Egypt, yes, is called Lower Egypt. Who's got more political power? The people in the north or the people in the south? Why? How can you know that just by looking at the map? Because this is the Nile Delta. This is where the most famous and powerful river in the region empties into the sea. And the place that had been given to Joseph's ancestors was just there to the right. The dynasty changed. The goals changed. And the Pharaoh kept talking. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and what? And war breaks out, there's that word, they will join our enemies and fight against us, then they will escape from the country. What's his perspective? He's worried. He's worried about military strength, and he's worried about the economy. Is he not worried about the economy? So they have an idea, this 18th dynasty. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their what? That is what you call a turn of fortune. They appointed, what's the next word? Brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They, what's the next word? Forced them to build the cities of Pithon and Ramesses as supply centers for the king. Now the next slide's a little long, but I'm going to read it to you. The thing I want you to understand is that in the change, it was swift, it was dramatic, and it was life-changing because frankly, friends, the heritage of these people, if you go back to when Joseph went to Pharaoh, which is where we are in Genesis 47, my father and my brothers with their flocks and herds. What was their occupation? Shepherds. They were shepherds. They kept livestock. They knew how to grow a few things for sure, I'm sure. And by the time you get to the end of this long slide that I have to change because it's too long, the Pharaoh is so impressed that when he says to them, you may dwell in the land of Goshen, up again at the top to the right of that beautiful fanning out of the Nile Delta. And if you know of any talented men among them, the Pharaoh at the time said, put them in charge of my own livestock. So again, I want you to understand the geopolitical situation. You remember what happened. It appears that in the story of the famine, the local leaders didn't really take it too seriously, because by the end of the story, when they were selling food to the world, the local leaders, the governors, if you want to call them that, came to Joseph and said, we're out of grain. Now how could you be out of grain? There were 7 years of harvests, such as, what does the scripture say? Had never been seen before. When Joseph was done calculating for the kingdom, he could not only feed the kingdom, but he could feed the world. But apparently the local leaders were like, Pishta, no thanks. So by the time it was over, they sold what? Their livestock, their land. They were now paying the Pharaoh to use the land they were standing on. So I just want you to understand that, because in the shift, because this was not true of Joseph's ancestors. They were exempt from taxation. They owned the land they stood on. So this was a swift change from herdsman, my friends, to brickmaker. A swift and difficult change. To make these bricks, they would have needed a water source. They would have needed the straw that goes inside that had to be harvested. They would have had to make it out of mud, but it wouldn't have been out of desert sand with water added. What kind of mud would they have made these bricks out of? Nile mud. So imagine them harvesting the mud that they were going to need. What's in the water? You know, besides the bacteria. Those people that are very, they have my dear sweet brothers and sisters here that use a lot of hand sanitizer are just like, wow. There are crocodiles and there are hippopotamus. Have you ever seen a mad hippopotamus? You don't want to see that. And these were not backyard sheds that these people were building. You're talking about the glory of Egypt. But more, the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more they did what? So they weren't wearing them out. They weren't wearing them down. They multiplied and expanded so that the Egyptians dreaded and were, what's the next word?
Exasperate.
See it like it is. Ready? Say it to your neighbor. Exasperated. Right? Right down to your marrow. They were exasperated by the Israelites. So, 18th dynasty comes along. This is Amenhotep the First. Amenhotep the First. He's got a great idea. Let's not just pressure them with hard labor. Let's go a little further while they're building and pulling and scraping. And I want you to read these texts. This is the same text in 4 different translations. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel. What are the last 2 words? The Egyptians, what's the next word? And forced the Israelis to serve them. And the Egyptians, what's the next word? Tyrannized the children of Israel by how? And the Egyptians made the Israelites serve how? Forcing them into severe slavery. I want you to feel it. I want you to feel the swiftness, the change, the difficulty that must have come to them, not only physically. They made their lives bitter with back-breaking work in mortar and bricks and every kind of work in the fields. All the jobs the Egyptians gave them were what? Brutally hard. And something that we want to be thoughtful of. Because Jesus called us to be salt and light. Thank you for the children's story. That was lovely. Light and salt. When you live in a world where a certain group of people has been given the authority to be awful and ugly to another group of people, that's like a cancer in your culture. Are you with me? So that means that the calling that we have to be an influence for something that is so heartily exactly the opposite is a high, high calling when these kinds of things are happening. Brutality. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave his order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. So imagine getting called into the Pharaoh's court for this meeting. This is going to be a very difficult and challenging meeting. Because the psalmist tells us that the Lord increased the people greatly and made them stronger than what? Their enemies. Did you ever try to do something against God? It's a bad idea. So I don't want to be so naive as to say get like the opposite of what you're hoping for, but in this situation it looks like that's what happened. Now the question that comes up is, were these midwives Hebrew midwives or Egyptian midwives? So the thing that we can agree on is that it was very likely a cooperative, like some midwifery groups are today. A cooperative midwives. For me, I fall on the Egyptian side, that they were overseers of what was going on with the Hebrew women, because I just don't see how they could have survived what happens later if they were Hebrews. So it's okay if your thought had always been that they were Hebrews, they might have been. But I fall on the side that they were the heads of the cooperatives of midwifery and that they were Egyptian women. The edict. And he says to these women, when you perform the duty of a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall do what? Kill him. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. Yeah, mercy is right. Horrific. Absolutely horrific. Could you imagine the chaos and the cries of horror in the slave quarters? We're talking about giving birth. It's supposed to be like one of the coolest days of your life. Not so here. Imagine the soldiers with their weapons doing their rounds through the slave quarters. It must have been absolutely terrifying. God says something very bright in here, which is kind of awesome. He says the midwives, however, did what? Did what?
Feared God.
There we go. You know that there was a large group of people who were not Israelites who eventually leave in the Exodus. So the seeds were begun to be planted. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They did what? So, if you need any encouragement for what to do in difficult times, here's a little encouragement. Because our responsibility, I believe in being a faithful and grateful and active citizen of this nation. I am grateful. But when I have to choose, here's what I have to choose. I have to fear God before men. So when the king of Egypt summoned the midwives, and this is why I think they're Egyptians, and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, oh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before I get there. I'm watching at the window, though. We're going to get this done as quietly as we can. Which, for those of you that have birthed a child, which I have not done, is a tall order, I'm sure. But they decided, friends, that they had to obey God rather than human beings. That's what the book of Acts says of them. And so God was pleased. He dealt with the midwives and the people. He dealt well with the midwives, and the people grew mightily. God's plans, obedience to him over human edicts. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Whatever they set their hands to, it prospered. Whatever they wanted to accomplish, it got done. God set them up because they feared him. So we do encounter moments, do we not, where our values and principles clash with societal expectations of our directives. And I think we should stay in step with our culture and our neighbors and our friends and our coworkers for as long as we can. Be close, be an influence. But there is coming, and has already come, depending on where you are, the time when we must choose. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people. So now it gets really dicey. Because now it's not just the midwives, it's who? Everyone. This is so dangerous. So cancerous to right thinking and common decency. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. Could you imagine? Could you imagine? Anybody had the right to take your son. So this is where we find ourselves, back at the beginning of the story. Amram, working as a slave, making bricks, stomping in the mud pits. It's likely that the women gathered the straw. Aaron. What is Aaron supposed to grow up to be? We know where Aaron ends up, but I want you to just stop for a moment and I want you to think about it. His father is a Levite. which means that he is a Levite, which means that there is a destiny on his life that has not been true generationally for his dad or his grandpa or his great-grandpa. But Amram is keeping it alive, keeping alive the calling on his son's life, because they were students of the word. Because they were living under a prophetic umbrella, just like you and I are living under a prophetic umbrella, and they knew what time it was in history. Friends, do not walk out of this door today unless you covenant with yourself that you will make sure that you renew, which is why I'm studying this book. Renew again your commitment to knowing where you are in history. So can you imagine when Jochebed told him she was pregnant? They've already got Aaron, they've already got Miriam, and now they're going to give birth to a son. If they do, they don't know whether or not they will, but if they do, if he's a boy, then he's living under a death decree. So I think there's a possibility that she birthed this boy like by herself. She's got a little experience, she's done it twice before, maybe she's got a close friend. And maybe our man Amram, because I'm thinking, how are they going to hide him? Maybe he's taking some of those skills as a brickmaker and he is building himself a trapdoor with a hideaway space in whatever possible way that could be done. I don't know. She became pregnant, she gave birth to a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now, I think Moses was a handsome. But that's not really what this word means. The language here is the same suggestion as when at the end of creation, God looked at it and said it was what? That's the inference. So it was multi-layered, multifaceted, whatever was good about this boy, Moses. So I imagine it was a very interesting 3 months. Trying to keep him quiet, trying to keep him hidden, maybe telling your neighbors that you'd miscarried or that your child was stillborn. Let me ask you a question. When Moses was living in that little slave hut under whatever circumstances he was living under, how many of his neighbors had lost their children to murder? This is a very fraught situation. So I can't imagine how you mamas would get that done. Hiding your 3-month-old all the way up until that point. And I had a sweet girl, the last time I preached this last Sabbath, she goes, I'll bet she dressed him in pink. I'll bet he had long curly hair. And she dressed him in pink. So I don't know what the strategy was. But by faith, with whatever smarts they used, they hid him for 3 months. And we're told something that's very interesting in the scriptures. By faith, they were not, what's the next word? Afraid to disobey the king's command. Where was the Pharaoh operating from? From a perspective of fear. We cannot operate from the same perspective. It doesn't mean we don't have trepidation. It doesn't mean that we don't just lay it down as an offering to the Lord. Like when we get a little nervous, I can hardly turn on the news anymore. It's so wow. But by faith, they saw that God had given them someone that might be the hearkening of the fulfillment of what they were hoping for. And so I don't know. Maybe this basket was something that she had all the time. I think she made it, and maybe she made it extra big at the beginning, but maybe it was a place, like if they had a little hide space for him and they put him inside it, maybe it was a place that he was familiar. Maybe it had a particular set of cloth and something that he would recognize, not only the feel, the size, the smell. And then one day she got a crazy idea. A crazy idea. Now, why would Jochebed have any kind of a thought about an ark on a body of water? All right? Now, it's trite, like a children's story. I'm serious. Do you understand, my friends? the importance, not just for parents, but for us as brothers and sisters, for us as husbands and wives, to reiterate the stories of the generations that have gone before us, so that they're in our marrow, written on the cells of our body, that our mitochondrial engines are running on them. And it's okay for you to have questions about the how and the why and how science fits into the whole thing. That's fine. I was meditating on the whole great controversy when I was driving here today. I was just like, Lord, suffering, I want to talk about it this morning. So I was just reviewing the great high points along the timeline, how America is actually written in the scriptures. It's not pretty, but she's there. And this great sweeping timeline, and how God is bringing all things to fruition. But it's built, friends, I went with Terry, we told you the story, where we walked the beaches of Normandy. When I stepped off the bus, the guide said to me, he said, make sure that you take some sand home. He said, this is your history. My life was built on their backs. Those young men who stormed those beaches, and the life I live is mortared with their blood. And I cannot be disrespectful to that as an American. And we can, in the same way, we must show tremendous respect to the narratives that have built this cathedral called our faith. And that's what Jochebed did. She had this crazy idea, because this notion of an ark on a body of water. And then she must have argued with herself, because what's in the water? Alligators and hippopotamus. One big chomp from either of them. But once the idea came into her head, she couldn't get it out of her head. And so she put tar and she put pitch on that basket that was probably in the little hidden room. And the thing that's so interesting is that every time we think about this, she's alone. All the beautiful pictures that I bumped into and the few that I chose, she's alone. But she very likely was not alone. And so could you imagine convincing your husband of this crazy idea that you've got? And she did, because Amram was a man of faith. So I believe that they chose a spot where they set him in the reeds on purpose. It was a spot that was either known where the princess came to bring her entourage, either on her royal barge, or there was, depending on which of the temples that you look at that are in the archaeological record, that came down to the river's edge for her personal bathing, for her personal worship. There would have been a lot of reasons for her to be there. So mom goes back home. Dad goes back home. They cannot be away from where they are supposed to be. They have to leave this child entirely in the Lord's care. Who stays? Miriam stays. One of those children, remember? Now, who picked him up? This is likely who picked him up. Her name was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut, that's her name. Now, she was young. She was somewhere between 10 and 15 years old. All right, so it's going to tell you something about her, because later when we get to the sermon that we're not going to get to today, and you find out where she ends up in terms of Egypt's royal line, drum roll, it's very exciting, you get this idea of the kind of person she was. There are very few female pharaohs in the pharaonic line in Egypt. The most famous one that we often think about is who? Cleopatra, thank you. But Hatshepsut will be in the pharaonic line, not just as a regent, but as a pharaoh. So this girl had a serious personality. So if you could imagine her just telling those servants and those ladies to go get her that basket because, oh, isn't this cool, baby? Now the thing that's interesting about the 18th dynasty is that there weren't any sons. The sons that were born, they died. So the people that lived were the daughters. And so this was a very easy decision in terms of who was around her and who was influencing her political ideas, even as a young girl. And there was another young girl there. She was about 9. So it's a very interesting story. Now think about who she became. Who did Miriam become? She has a title in Scripture. What do they call her? She's a worship leader. Nice. And she speaks prophetic words. This is quite the family. Quite the family. So if you could imagine her, all the pictures that we have of Hatshepsut, they've got her much older than she likely was. And so Miriam approaches and says, hey, you need some help? Because I've got an idea about some help. And so what's her suggestion? That this nursing child needs a nurse. And so they work out an arrangement where Jochebed is going to become this child's nurse. Thank you, Miriam. And if we could see what was unseen in those moments, we would see the angels moving and directing what's happening to preserve his life, to protect that ark, and to bring him to the place where he came to. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, take this child away and nurse it for me. She's now talking to Jochebed because Miriam has made it all the way back home. And I will give you what? Now, how did this change Jochebed's immediate circumstances? Does she have to go gather straw anymore? She does not. Okay? Her baby that everybody assumed, which she was very happy for them to assume, had died at birth, is not dead. Their sons are dead, and her son is not. So just let that sink in, because we want the story to be real. And not only is their sons, some of their sons are dead, her son is not dead, and now she's going to be paid. Why? What's the money for? It's for her to make sure she's well nourished. You think other people in her community are well nourished? No. This is your homework this afternoon. This is the most amazing miracle. But let me ask you, sometimes we pray for something, and when we get it, is it easy? Not easy. Changed everything. Who else did it change things for? Thank you. Say it again. Miriam and Aaron. If her hunch that this boy was the fulfillment of the timeline, then she felt a very specific obligation, like Mary must have felt, to train him, to teach him, at the expense of Miriam and Aaron. I'm sorry. Seems plain to me that there's no way that those two did not pay a price for what happened here. Not just among their friends, among the community that was yakking, because now people must have been jealous of what had come to her. Does that make any difference to God's plan? Sometimes it's hard to walk in the place where God has asked us to walk. And for the greater good, we must be willing to do so. So here's this boy living between two worlds. Now, in ancient Near Eastern culture, I would have expected her to give him back when he was about 4 years old, because that's when he would have been weaned. But it doesn't look like he went back when he was 4 years old. It looks like he went back later. And Hatshepsut's age makes that very reasonable. She wasn't ready to take care of him full time. Obviously, he would have gone to the harem in the palace. But there must have been some kind of, obviously, divine intervention, but even some kind of amicable relationship between him being with Jochebed and possibly spending some time at the palace. I don't know. But I know that he lived between two worlds until the day that she had to give him over fully to the life that God was calling him to. She poured herself out, my friends. I want to remind you as we close the powerful influence of one life, of one investment, of one honest and humble and hardworking Christian to make a difference in the world that they live in. Do you want to be one of those people? Absolutely. So watch. Here's what we're told. Moses was fitted to take preeminence among the great of the earth, to shine in the courts of its most glorious kingdom, and to sway the what? The scepter of its power. Hatshepsut, when she took the throne later, acted as regent to a stepson who was not of royal blood. So that wasn't Moses, but what I'm trying to tell you is that it could have been. And when we get to the sermon, when we get to Moses, then we'll find out what the dividing line was between him and his mother. It's powerful and sad and amazing. Moses was fitted to take preeminence among the great of the earth, to shine in the courts of its most glorious kingdom, and to sway the scepter of its power. His intellectual greatness distinguishes him above the great men of how many ages? All ages. As historian, poet, philosopher, general of armies, as legislator, he stands without a peer. Yet the world before him, with the world before him, laid at his feet, there in the Nile Delta, he had the moral strength to refuse the flattering prospects of wealth and greatness and fame, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, and that is largely because of his parents, and at the expense, likely, of his siblings. God's calling is hard, but it can be powerful and for great, great good. Don't you want that kind of calling on your life? That it might not be easy, but it will be an influence for great good. By faith, the scripture says, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Friends, if we're going to survive what's already happening, if we're going to survive what's coming, then we have got to know to whom we belong and where we are going. And we have got to be able to let go of the things that are holding us, the habits that are pursuing us. And it won't be easy, but it will be amazing. In those reeds and rushes on that river, angels were there. Let's do that. What do you think? Are you in?